All right, folks. So, hey, we're going to be covering our second unit this week on intersectionality. And the reading for this week is going to be on gendering racial formations and a pretty broad discussion on intersectionality. I'm going to get more into the concept and its history once we get into the lecture. But the reason why this is important is we want to take a really close look at the way in which different social identity categories interact with one another, and also understand that the types of oppression out there, or the types of, or the systems that are out there that disenfranchise certain people from being their full selves, actualizing socioeconomic prosperity, so on and so forth, compound oftentimes when you occupy um, multiple identities, right? And I think now in your generation, this is a lot more commonplace to have conversations about what it means to be a woman of color, to be, poor and differently able, to be LGBT plus and an immigrant, so on and so forth. But for a long time in, the US and in a part of our kind of normal American culture, we did not have these conversations, and you really did not explore the ways in which these types of, or if there were specific issues that impacted people of color who are also maybe differently able, maybe LGBT plus, maybe an immigrant, a woman, so on and so forth. And so this analysis is very important because one, it helps us flesh out the ways in which sub communities within a certain marginalized community are also being exploited. But one of the things that the author really stresses in the article that I had you guys read for this week is that when we look at things in isolation, we oftentimes don't address other more deleterious or more harmful issues. So if we're focusing mostly on race, or focusing mostly on gender, or focusing mostly on immigration status, whatever that looks like, we may miss how these systems that have been harming individuals are also harming specific individuals in very complex and nuanced ways, and that we don't want to fix only one small superficial problem and then have these other larger problems remain, because they can have much bigger effects on said community. So with that, let's get started. So as with all of our lectures, we have this kind of general layout. So I'm going to be talking about the co-construction of identity categories and what those identity categories are. This idea of matrix of domination, first developed by Patricia L. Collins, which is going to help guide our thinking about intersectionality. And then we're going to do a little bit of intersectional analysis and look at some intersectionality examples. You have four big key terms for this lecture. And like I said, I will be developing a glossary that will be available on Canvas for you to go back to, especially as you get ready to do your reading reflections in the coming weeks. But just so we have clarity on this, so we're going to be covering identity category. And so definition for this is physical, social, and mental characteristics of an individual or of individuals. Examples of social identities are race and ethnicity. Remember, those are socially constructed. Gender, social class, socioeconomic status. That means, rich, poor, so on and so forth. Sexual orientation, disabilities, right? And religion and religious beliefs. The matrix of domination is a sociological concept that explains issues of oppression that deal with race, class, and gender, which, despite being fundamentally different, are all interconnected. Marginalization, this idea of to put or keep someone in a powerless or unimportant position within a society or group. It helps us consider how issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Oh, sorry, that shouldn't be in there. Let me and then intersectionality and intersectional analysis. This helps us consider how issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, age, and immigration status intersect to affect people differently and interconnectedly. So first, One of the things that the author for this week really stresses in the chapter Gender and Racial Formation is this understanding that race and gender are co-constructed at the same time. So like with race, there are many other identity categories that are socially constructed. Again, we've talked about this: race, ethnicity, gender, social class, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, disabilities, religious and religious beliefs, right? So when we're thinking about other identity categories, now we do understand that there is a sense of biological sex, right? So this is what you've been born with. If we're thinking about, anatomy, the difference with gender is that gender has come to become more nuanced and complicated over time, like with race, right? So what defines masculinity and femininity has, changed. We've seen this evolve in terms of style, in terms of behaviorisms, so on and so forth. And so, although we can say with a degree of certitude that there is a anatomical difference between males and females, realistically, men and women are fundamentally the same, aside from obviously the anatomy part of it. And it has only been a process of politic that has made men and women fundamentally different, right? And there are lots of examples, not in this class. I would encourage you to take more of a history class on this. We will see this a little bit later in some of the readings that we'll do, especially on Indigenous communities. But fundamentally, men and women have always played central roles in decision-making, child rearing, business, labor, so on and so forth. It's only that Western understandings and Western religious understandings of women's roles with bigger quotes there, as being, within this domestic sphere, has, pushed our American society to, require women to be in certain roles, right? Whether that be domestic, maybe types of labor, so on and so forth. And sociology of gender courses will explore this more in terms of what we've called like gender typing for work. So like women becoming nurses, women becoming teachers, women becoming home healthcare workers, men doing, construction jobs, so on and so forth. But all of that, again, is politically inclined. Through much of Latin America, women fought in wars. They were actually on the front line in terms of being soldiers. Around the world, we've actually seen women in much higher leadership roles. So Germany has had a female prime minister. So has England, a variety of other Western and advanced countries, and some non-Western advanced countries have also had women as leaders. It is only here in the US and in other places that we've really stressed women as not being as capable as men. But again, that is politically contextual. One thing to think about that too when we're thinking about social class is that classes didn't exist prior to industrialization and the advent of money, right? People were just fundamentally elite or poor or peasants. And we've seen that become much more nuanced as individuals have been able to gain wealth and income that have put them in different economic positions, right? Sexual orientation has obviously proliferated a lot in terms of the way in which we even think about sexuality today. Previously, it was really just this kind of problematic pathologization of folks who are gender non-conforming or gender fluid in the sense of homosexuality. And what we see now as a really great stride from the LGBTQI plus community has been the advent of all of these other different categories associated with what we consider to be gender non-conforming, right? This idea or this non-cisgender or non-cis or systemic heterosexuality kind of identity, right? So when I was younger, it was really just LGBT, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, and even trans was still becoming newer at the time. And now we've seen all of these new categories emerge, and even some just trying to depart from all of that altogether, right? Again, within this idea of being socially constructed. Disabilities changed over time, especially as we've considered more and new mental health ability issues and physical ability issues. alongside these, right? And even with religion, right? We've seen this happen too: xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, so on and so forth, as a part of this larger kind of piece of not only identity categories, but the ways in which folks are marginalized because of their various or the various ways that they identify. So just remember that these identity categories emerge at certain historical moments and evolve depending on political and economic conditions. So when we are in a Me Too political moment, we will have much more acceptance of, women and folks in that sense. However, if we are in a much more conservative time or in a much more conservative state, i.e. Texas, right, as they're going through this kind of massive ban on abortion under extremely problematic and unconstitutional frameworks, that has changed the way in which we see not only women, but women's health specifically, right? So again, these are going to be always contextual and conditional. So I've given you a kind of list here of identity categories. I didn't have this be a part of your key terms only because realistically, this course is focusing mostly on race and ethnicity, which we've already talked about in the previous week's lectures. But again, race is a social categorization based upon phenotypical differences. Remember, we see race, what is a visible aspect, right? And this is used to establish hierarchical social orders based upon physical distinctions, right? So my dark skin as being different from yours, and my dark skin being not as beautiful or not as worthy as folks with lighter skin. Ethnicity is the cultural values and norms that distinguish the members of a given group from others. Ethnic groups consist of individuals that collectively identify and share a common awareness, right? So we all identify and understand ourselves as Latino or as Asian American versus being of a race that is often ascribed to us because of our skin tone. Okay. Class is the social status attributed to one's income, wealth, and possessions. So that means the money you earn and the money you have is attributed to your class position. So upper class, middle class, working class, so on and so forth. Gender is the social understanding of behaviors appropriate for each sex, i.e. boys will be boys and that is girls stuff, okay? Now, again, gender is fluid because what is considered to be masculine at one point or something that men do versus what women do will change depending on the historical moment. We've seen in the pandemic a big push of men trying to do more child rearing, which is considered typically to be quote unquote women's work. But that's been largely because they're home, right? We've also seen a transformation in the understanding of what women can do in the workforce. And that's been one because of their own political aspirations and desires to not be just domesticated, but also an understanding within the working world that we can no longer have women just be at home, that the one parent or the one earner household is no longer tenable in our current economic situation unless said person who is making all the money is making an exorbitant amount of money, right? Sexuality is the way people experience and express themselves sexually. This involves biological, erotic, physical, emotional, social, or spiritual feelings and behaviors. Because it is a broad term which has varied over time. It lacks a precise definition, right? And sexuality is always changing, right? We think of sexuality within this aspect of who are you, sexually attracted to, but we also want to be cognizant of how this interacts with romance or what we have or what we understand as being romantic or engaging in romantic-based relationships. We've also had people, experience this in different contexts as it pertains to being sapiosexual, so being attracted to somebody's intellect. Maybe there's something more into the way in which folks interact with their spirituality and how that, draws them to each other sexually. And so it is not just fundamentally that men are attracted to women or women are attracted to men or males attracted to females and females attracted to males and the converse. Rather that there's a panoply or a big range of factors that one may find attractive in a partner. And because of that, we really can't narrow down what draws individuals into, romantic or sexual relationships, rather that it is extremely varying. And because our society is continuously evolving, we will see sexuality evolve along with it. So because there is because there's an established social order of dominance, we need to understand dominance impacts all of these different subgroups, right? So there is an overarching system of oppression that suppresses people in interrelated ways, maybe not exactly the same, but very similarly, right? So the matrix of domination, again, is a sociological concept that explains issues of oppression that deal with race, class, gender, which, despite being fundamentally different, are all interconnected. So what we can see here in the center realm is all of the individuals that would have essentially power. And then outside of that is all of the other individuals, right? So in a traditional society, we would see something along the lines of a, maybe, let's say, heterosexual man who's white, having all power. So before, we would see something more like, we would see something more like a society organized around white people, right? And particularly what we've seen folks, or where we've seen this a lot, is with what are called WASPs. So white Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Saxon Protestant individuals, right? So that's going to be a racial category and ethnic category because of Anglo-Saxon, and then lastly a religious-based group, right? What this model of matrix of domination helps us understand is that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And one, the dominant group is much more narrow, and all of these other individuals are marginalized under this framework. So essentially, we have all power residing within men who are heterosexual, who are young, they speak English, they're able-bodied, they're rich, either they are professional or educated, or maybe they're just born wealthy, and then they're European Anglo-Americans, right? So that is the dominant group, right? So women lack power, LGBT plus folks lack power, the very young or the very old, so children and or elderly, anybody who doesn't speak English, essentially, disabled people, poor and uneducated, and then lastly, people of color. And then you could add into this immigration status. So folks who are citizens versus non-citizens, or folks who are not full citizens, right, could also be a part of this framework. And so I want you to think of it in this way. When we think about all of all of the highest positions in the United States, whether that be business, media, or politics, it is always one of these individuals that resides in that. So of the 45 presidents that we've had in the United States, they've all been Christian white men of wealthy backgrounds. They've never been poor immigrants, so on and so forth. The only exception to that, I'm sorry, is a Barack Obama. And in the vice presidency, likewise, it's only been Kamala Harris. So for the past 45 or for the past 46 iterations of presidencies, it has always been a white male of a particular wealthy status that's been able to hold that type of power over the country, right? Likewise with CEOs, you see this same. Almost all billionaires and millionaires are mostly white men who are business owners, professionals, so on and so forth. In media, top grossing stars, white men, so on and so forth, right? So the reason why this is important for us to understand in terms of the social relationships is that when you are of any other group, right, you are opened up to or can be vulnerable to mistreatment. And we're going to see some examples of that a little bit later in this lecture. So so here we can see kind of the matrix example. So this infographic gives us a breakdown of how LGBT plus people are impacted by various systems, right? So these LGBT plus people of color, right? So 1 in 3 people of color identify as LGBT plus. They have the highest levels of poverty. Of that, many of these folks are raising children. They have higher unemployment rates. They're less likely to have health insurance, and they are more likely to face discrimination, right? So something that is unique to their experience, right? And so this analysis that particularly comes from feminists of color intellectuals show how individuals like this face marginalization. So marginalization is to put or keep someone in a powerless or unimportant position within a society. One is often marginalized in at least two or more of these ways when we're thinking about the idea of intersectionality, right? So that can be race, class, gender, sexuality or sexual preference, orientation, expression, ability, citizenship status, religion, and or caste, although we don't have technically a caste in our society. So if we're going back to this example, we're seeing LGBT plus people of color, right? Now, there could be even more if we're thinking about folks that identify as woman or female, male, so on and so forth, in terms of the way that this kind of interacts. But clearly we see that these individuals, you know, LGBT plus and trans people of color have, again, higher rates of poverty, right? Many of these folks are raising children, right, who are not able to get access to certain things that they need to be able to survive, right? And so this idea of intersectionality is kind of foundational in sociological analysis. And I try to give this Venn diagram to really show how we can understand it in an analytical sense, right? It helps us consider how issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, inability, and age, right? And again, immigration status, we don't want to leave that out either, intersect to affect people differently and interconnectedly. So when we're thinking about race and racism affects people across various spectrums, right? As does sexism. And then when those two interact, right, they're gonna affect people in very interconnected ways, right? And then also very specific ways. And I'll show an example of that in a little bit. So we want to use this concept as a tool to understand how social forces and issues impact the life chances and social mobility of various marginalized groups. And what I'll say in terms of life chances and social mobility. So social mobility is the ability for you to work and earn money, you know, to move up and down the social socioeconomic status, right? So from high class to low class, so on and so, or low class to high class, so on and so forth. And your life chances are going to also be impacted. So your ability to go to school, get a good job, save for a house, buy a house, so on and so forth, right? When we're thinking about intersectionality and we're thinking about the ways that these things interact with one another, so whether we're thinking about, you know, kind of a racism or a xenophobia or ethnocentrism within ethnicity, if we're thinking about sexism or homophobia within, you know, within gender and sexuality, if we're thinking about maybe like a xenophobia and or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia and religion, or we're thinking about, you know, ableism with abilities, so on and so forth. These things all operate out of one central nexus of power, right? That we have a dominant group in society, and all of these other individuals that are not a part of that group, going back to our conversation with race and ethnicity last week, those individuals don't have as much power and are more likely to be exploited, okay? And let me, I'm going to prime these videos that will give us a bit of an explainer on what intersectionality looks like.
Many years ago, I began to use the term intersectionality to deal with the fact that many of our social justice problems like racism and sexism are often overlapping, creating multiple levels of social injustice. Now, the experience that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma de Graffenried. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. She applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma de Graffenried was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither African-American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness law's refusal to protect African-American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African-American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African-American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I'd come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance, sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white, and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, Black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism, and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and center the voices and work of marginalized individuals.
So what we want to understand, as Professor Crenshaw and this other video shares, is that, again, we have all of these various systems of oppression operating from, these various aspects of our society, limiting people's ability, but they don't work in isolation. They actually work collectively. And what I will stress in this week's lecture, especially when we move into next week as we talk about racism and systemic oppression, is that the process or the framework for oppression comes from this idea of dehumanization. And all of these social categories that we've talked about early on in this lecture have been trying to, from the social construct and from the political and economic level, create individuals as different or cast individuals as different for their exploitation. So when we're thinking about non-white or non-American or non-Anglo-European ethnicities, right? So whether you're a person of color or you're, not considered to be the historic white, which are Anglo-Saxons coming from like Britain, for example, you've been made to seem different so much so that you've been dehumanized, and that can set you up for exploitation, exclusion, eradication, right? That's something we talked about last week. The same is true for gender, right? We've cast women as different, fundamentally inferior, right? To deny them rights, to exploit them, so on and so forth, right? We've cast folks who are gender nonconforming, gender fluid, or just express their gender differently or their sexuality differently from cisgender heterosexuals. And in doing so, that has created a condition where we've excluded many LGBT plus folks, right? Same with religion, when we're thinking about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or any kind of xenophobia against any immigrant group that doesn't, practice Protestantism or Christianity. Same thing with ability, same thing with age, right? And so that dominant framework, and if we go back to our very first slide with this, this very isolated group, these folks all hold all the power. These all folks are either excluded, disenfranchised, marginalized, exploited, so on and so forth, in a way that one enables these individuals to retain power, right? So let's look at this in analysis, right? So if we're looking at a race-based issue, we can kind of think about police shootings in the United States. Been a hot topic for a while. Okay, so here in 2018, we can look at the US population. We're going to look at killed by police, unarmed, not attacked, right? So although African Americans take up about 12.6% or 13%, likewise with Hispanics, 16% of the US population, African Americans are almost twice as likely, right, to be killed by police generally. And, Hispanics are a little bit higher than the conventional average. White Americans are less likely to be killed by police. When we're thinking about unarmed, right, again, higher rates for both African American and Hispanic compared to their general population standpoint, white being the least likely. And then, unarmed, non-attacking African Americans are the highest, right? So when we're thinking about race here, people of color have a higher instance of police killing, right? So people of color. Now in gender, when we're thinking about the wage gap, right? So women make less than men on average, right? And that's doesn't matter the time frame from the 60s to the mid 80s. We can say clear deficit. There's a bit of a bump here from the 80s to the 90s, and the 2000s right to the 2010s, a big bump, or a slightly larger bump, right? But still a huge deficit, right? Women are making almost half of what men are making, right? In terms of their overall annual earnings, right? In the 3 time periods. Now let's overlap this with race, right? So we're going to I'm going to focus mostly here on women of color and white men, right? So when we're thinking about the gender wage gap for African American and Hispanic women, these folks, or women of color, right, make far less. So for every man's dollar, right, a Caucasian woman makes about 78 cents. So that's roughly about 22% less than white men. When we're thinking about African American women, they're making about 62 cents. So that's a 60, they're making about 60% of what men make, or about 38% less, right? And then Hispanic women are making 54, which is about 46% less, right? So that's a huge deficit in difference when we're thinking about that overall earnings, right? And that translates into a big deficit here when we're thinking about their lifetime earnings, right? So a white man will make about 2.7 million, right? African American man's going to make about 1.8, Hispanic about 2 million, right? So roughly about the same. There's still, a pretty large difference, about a deficit of about $1 million in lifetime annual earnings, right? If we compound that by gender, right? So white women make clearly less than white men, right? But Black women and Hispanic women are making far less than white men, right? So the systems of racism and sexism are overlapping at this point in terms of income, or in terms of earning power, right, to further marginalize women of color. So if we were to say tomorrow that we're going to pass legislation that's going to ensure that all people, regardless of race, are going to be paid the same, that's not going to deal with this gender-based issue. And if we're going to say, okay, we want to make sure that we pay all women equally, it's not going to deal with the race issue. And that's that point where we have to be much more cognizant of how these individuals that are in more complicated and specific identity categories, right, or in multiple identity categories, are further marginalized, right? Because even if I were to deal with race and, let's say, just gender here, maybe I'm not thinking about sexuality, ability, so on and so forth, right? A little bit more here on this, right? So you can see these deficits in terms of percentages on those annual earnings, right? All races and ethnicities, women make about 20% less than men. And then we see these major deficits across all other aspects, right? So Asian women making less, Hispanic women making less, uh, Black women making less, right? White women making less, so on and so forth, right? And this is translated into huge issues in terms of homelessness and other social problems. One thing that the pandemic really fleshed out for us was the issues that women of color were facing in terms of childcare, which actually ended up translating into these huge rates of women of color withdrawing from the labor force because they had to, stay home and take care of their kids when their kids couldn't go to school, right? Which has exacerbated an already big problem in terms of homelessness, where here on the right, we can see the huge homelessness rates for single moms of color, right? So we're thinking about all women who are all single moms that are homeless, more than 40 to 50% of these populations are actually people of color or women of color, right? Another way we can look at this is within life expectancy. So I always like to use this as a big piece in terms of how we understand social inclusion. And I know this is going to be a bit of a stretch, but bear with me on this. So life expectancy and infant mortality are two major ways we can gauge not only health and welfare in the United States, but also health and welfare for women. Okay. The reason why is that if women of color are dying earlier or their children are having issues very early on, that means that there's a denial of meaningful health care for specific groups, right? And in this case, women of color. So on the first table that we can see from 2014, we're going to look at the comparable rates between various racial and ethnic groups, right? And life expectancy. So African Americans in this case have a lower life expectancy than whites, right? So about a 4% difference, or I'm sorry, about a 4-year difference in terms of their overall, right? Also here, what we can see is infant mortality rate. So basically all races and ethnicities that are non-white, right, aside from Asian Americans, although I would say the data is a little bit complicated, have lower infant mortality rates, meaning that their children are not making it to their first year of life. They're dying beforehand, right? And what can explain some of this, again, is housing and environment. So if we go back, right, we see women of color with less access to wealth, right? They're having higher homelessness rates. The work that they are doing is more stressful, right? Which is going to lead to other related issues like depression, maybe substance abuse, so on and so forth. We'll get into this more later in the semester, but maybe they don't have access to healthy food and recreation. We know this is food insecurity. So many of you that may have used the Viking Vault are aware of the services that the colleges provide through the Viking Vault and giving food, to folks who are facing food insecurity. That could be another issue, right? And then obviously the availability of healthcare services, which has been huge, obviously in the pandemic, as we've seen more folks struggle with getting access to healthcare as as COVID's kind of run rampant, right? And I wanted to show this last example that I think really fleshes this out. So back in 2019, two very wealthy and well-known white women, Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin, were sentenced to very light prison sentences for a big scandal where they had paid significant amounts of money to get their kids into elite schools. And this was huge, one, because it exposed something that we've already had known for a number of years, that white folks have been using their power, influence, and money to get their kids into schools well above what people of color have been able to. So that has been already a part of that general white elitism. But what's going to be interesting about the Tanya McDowell and Kelly Williams Bowler cases, which you'll see a little bit on Tanya's in the video clip I'm going to show in a second, is that although yes, Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin did face some jail time for manipulating the system. Felicity Huffman faced 14 days. Lori Loughlin faced 2 months. Tanya McDowell was sentenced to 3 years and served 3 years of a 5-year sentence. And Kelly Williams Buller was actually sent to jail. I think she only spent 10 days in jail, but she was originally sentenced to almost 60 years for stealing education from folks. The difference is Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin paid to get their kids into elite universities. Tanya McDowell and Kelly Williams Buller had enrolled their kids in different school districts so that their kids could get a better education, and were charged with stealing education from a public education system, right? Not a university system that they had paid to enroll their children in, rather just like the schools that we should have, equal and open access to.
Okay, we've been telling you about Tanya McDowell. She's the single homeless mother who stands accused of stealing her son's public education.
Tanya McDowell is a Connecticut mother jailed for what authorities call stealing an education. That is, for registering her son AJ at an address not in the school district where she last lived before becoming homeless. In April of 2011, Connecticut police arrested McDowell and charged her with first-degree larceny for allegedly stealing an education for her son, AJ.
So your son was in Head Start.
Right.
What kind of a student was he in Head Start?
He was good.
Yeah.
Good student.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You saw a lot of promise in him?
I saw a lot of progress. I saw a lot of potential in him. I saw a lot of just intelligence and talent.
So what did you do next?
So next I did was I went to a local school office where they basically are the ones who place all the children in the school that
They're supposed to go to?
They're supposed to go to. So I didn't know anything about Brookside Elementary without someone telling me about it. So when I went over there, the lady told me, she was okay, he could go to this school.
Was it a school board?
It was yeah, right.
Okay, what about Brookside did you like?
I like the fact that it was less student in the classroom. He could get more one-on-one attention. I also like the fact that it was parent-teacher friendly. Registered my son started school, stayed in school, doing great in school, never missed a day of school. Everything was just going fine.
So on the paperwork that you filled out, what address did you use?
The address I use when I fill out the paperwork is my godkid's mother.
So this is someone you're very close to?
Someone I'm very close with, someone I know for many, many years.
So how long was your son in school, at the school that you preferred for him before your troubles began?
As I recall, it was during winter. So I want to say between January and February.
What year?
2011.
And so tell me what happens on one Friday, he comes home from school. It's a normal weekend, I'm assuming. And,
yeah, it's a normal weekend.
And then what happens Monday?
We woke up that Monday, ate breakfast, put everything that he needs for school, that's on his agenda and stuff. And then we just went to Brookside. And then when I drove all the way over there, they told me that he was no longer enrolled there. I would have to find a new school.
So did they tell you what they expected you to do with AJ?
No, they said I got to find the right school district for him. And that's when I enrolled him the same day to a school in Bridgeport.
When did your legal troubles begin?
Someone told me that, someone looking for you. They had your picture on a piece of paper. So I was like, what? They're like, the cops looking for you. And she was like, I think you have a warrant. So I was like, a warrant for what? I said, I don't have no warrant. So I said, okay, I'll go find out what it's about. But then when I showed up and they were like, oh, you're going to be arrested for larceny? I said, larceny for what? I ain't steal anything. They were like, yeah, you did. You stole education. I was like, what? Yeah. I thought it was something for student loans. But for sending my son to school, that was the least.
You were pretty stunned.
Yeah, I was like, unbelievable. I never heard of that before.
Was it a policeman who told you this?
Yeah.
Did they arrest you in that moment?
Yeah, they had me in a cell and everything.
They put you in a jail cell?
So, yeah, to wait while they did the paperwork.
After the larceny charges were filed, undercover Connecticut police additionally charged McDowell with 4 counts of drug trafficking, charges she and her lawyer adamantly denied. Now facing 115 years behind bars, McDowell did what she thought was best for her son and accepted a plea offer on all of the charges brought against her by the government.
The reason why I think Tanya's case is important is because, one, it highlights that the education system in America needs to be fixed. It highlights the fact that poor people of all colors, all races, should have equal education. Second reason why her case is important is because it highlights the fact that the system has been so broken that parents long ago have done the same thing that Tanya did. But for some reason today, Black mothers in particular are being arrested.
McDowell served 3 years out of a 5-year sentence in a women's prison in Connecticut.
I believe that my son had all the rights to be in that school. He didn't get in trouble in that school. He had perfect attendance. He was doing everything right. And I feel like he should be deprived of an education just because of your color of your skin, where you live, just because you're not in the league with everybody else and who pay more taxes. It doesn't matter.
McDowell has about 1.5 years left on her sentence.
Okay. So the reason why I bring this example up, and trust me, we could go on and on with many, many examples of these, is with the McDowell case. I like what the attorney put, that one, this shows that our education system is fundamentally unequal, right? Because the reality that many folks are moving districts to find better schools in a public education that is supposed to be equal is already something that should be alarming. And remember, this kind of takes us back to issues with, precious knowledge, in that we have seen schools that do little for students of color, right? Whether that be, again, from the Precious Knowledge documentary or the Zavala and Sleater reading that I had you guys read in that first week. The other thing I think is very important to stress with this as well, right, is that there has been a push to criminalize Black women for doing right by their children, right? And if we go back to the slide, and again, this isn't the only time that this has happened, but in the Kelly Williams Bowler case, Miss Williams Bowler was enrolling her her 2 daughters in a different school district in Akron, Ohio, and was jailed, for doing so. They alleged that she was participating in tax evasion, and they wanted to, recoup money that she hadn't paid the district, even though she paid her taxes generally. And so, in the 2 cases side by side here, each of these women faced, extensive jail sentences, and actually one served a pretty hefty set of time, where these white women did not do so, right? And they largely did similar offenses, right? They stole or gamed quote unquote the education system to do right by their children. However, right, Black women were facing a much higher rate of incarceration, because of this, right? And what's interesting, as we have some of these conversations where, women are lacking, abortion care access, right? We've seen women of color forcibly sterilized in prison, right? When we've seen issues of workplace harassment and Me Too, the focus has been on, white women, but not on the numerous issues that women of color have faced in these types of moments. So with that, we've covered a lot today. So we've covered the co-construction of identity categories. Remember that these all kind of emerge from historical and political moments, depending on the time, right? What those identity categories are: race, class, gender, sexuality. And I didn't go into ability, but again, ability follows along that same route, in the sense that we've developed understandings of human difference based upon, quote unquote, ability, right? We're looking at this idea of matrix of domination. So this overarching system where, cisgender, heterosexual, white men who are elite, who speak English, that are rich, hold all of the power, and then essentially all of these other subgroups have less power, or are, quote unquote, marginalized, right? This idea of intersectionality, right, and an intersectional analysis, where we are starting to kind of peel back the layers of all of the ways in which individuals, dependent on their various categories, right, are marginalized. And one that again shows where all of the power resides in our society, and then how we've seen over time various communities face, again, different but interrelated aspects of discrimination, right? So whether it be the Latina immigrant mother who's picked up taking her children to school because she's undocumented, or in the case of what we saw with Tanya McDowell being, incarcerated for enrolling her, son in the wrong school, although they are not being targeted in the exact same way, they are being targeted within an educational context, right? So, undocumented woman taking her child to school, right? A Black woman taking her child to a better school, right? And again, we have these, major key terms that we've covered today. So identity categories, matrix of domination, marginalization, and intersectionality. So hang on to these ideas. Again, you'll be using them to help with your first reading reaction paper. And if you have questions, always feel free to email me and we can discuss this further. Thank you.